Okay, thank you folks for coming. This public lecture, we're calling it, is organised by the Asia Institute, the Indonesia Forum, and the Indonesian postgraduate students in the Faculty of Arts of the University of Melbourne. And in fact, I have to say that it was the latter, the postgraduate students who are most responsible for putting everything together and making this event possible. So, sort of a note of appreciation to the postgraduate students here. So our speaker today is Professor Richard Robison from Murdoch University. A lot of you will know who he is. He's retired from Murdoch University now, but he's most known for his 1986 book, Indonesia, The Rise of Capital, which was the first book really to talk about the emergence of Indonesian capitalism and the Indonesian capitalist class. He is noted as, I would say, the foremost political economist of Indonesia. Among his other publications are a little book written with me called Reorganizing Power in Indonesia, Politics of Oligarchy in the Asian Market, so it's 2004. So on this occasion, we've asked Dick to speak on a topic that seems to be talked about quite a bit in Australia in relation to Indonesia, and it's about the possibilities of Indonesia rising as the next regional great power in Asia. And in fact, if you've seen the title of Dick's talk, he is going to be casting some questions about that sort of assumption. I think the title of the talk is Why Indonesia Won't Be the Next Great Power in Asia. Okay, so that's the title. So Dick will speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a bit more than an hour actually to have a discussion. So that was actually the point, to have a lot of discussion, and we'll be able to have a bit more than an hour of that. So Dick?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great to be here in Melbourne. The weather's just what I expected, just what I'd heard that Melbourne's like, but I'm sure you have a few sunny days every now and then. Of course, coming from Perth, that's all we have, just sunny days and swimming at the beach. And anyway, Fedi and I have been working on a paper, and we were asked to write a paper for a journal called About Indonesia Rising. And I think we were both a bit hesitant about it, because neither of us really felt that there was much of an argument or much of a debate to be had. And that if you look at all of the data, I think, and once you decide what it means to be a rising country, we didn't think that there was, very much to say about it. And indeed, when we looked at the people who wrote about Indonesia rising, for the most part, they ended up with the same conclusions, that really it's not rising. And the real problem was to argue why it wasn't rising, or why they thought it was rising. But nevertheless, it's interesting to talk about this topic for several reasons. One is that we can argue a more general point, and that is, the general point is, can new countries rise? We've heard about the BRICS. You've all heard about the BRICS. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China. And they were supposed to be the new wave of countries going to rise up and challenge the old dominant countries of Europe, North America, and Japan. And what seems to be happening is that apart from China, this is not happening. So the big question is, how do can countries break in on this club of big, powerful countries? You know, how do we know when a country is becoming more powerful and more influential? If we say Indonesia is rising, what should we be looking for? And what will tell us if indeed it has really risen? And there, I think, the sort of questions that I'm interested in and that Paddy's interested in. And we want to have a look at the debate about Indonesia rising, because there are all these books about it and even courses about it. So we want to have a look and see why people think it's rising, why they think it's not rising, and whether or not this is just something to do and say at the present time. Now, it's interesting when you look at all this literature about Indonesia rising, that it's less than 2 decades ago that Indonesia seemed to be unravelling in a vast economic and political crisis. If you think back to 1997, 98 and 99, what happened? Well, firstly, there was an economic crisis where banks and corporate empires collapsed in huge debt and capital flight. The rupiah collapsed. Public and private debt soared. Many Indonesian businesses became bankrupted. Well, they didn't become bankrupted. They become insolvent, because it's difficult to become bankrupt in Indonesia. I don't think there's any bankruptcy laws. But and the IMF came in with a whole new set of requirements for reform and reorganisation in Indonesia. And of course, 2 years after that collapse, President Suharto, who had ruled Indonesia for over 30 years, was thrown out of office. There were riots in the streets of Jakarta and Medan and other capital cities, and Indonesia was plunged into the unknowns of some future political system that no one knew anything about. So it seems amazing that, less than 2 decades later, a lot of people are talking about Indonesia as Asia's next giant, Indonesia rising. What's happened in this short time. It's not that countries don't have crises and recover very quickly, but whenever they do, it still needs explaining. And there is indeed a large literature around the place about Indonesia rising. Among academics, of course, we see the book by Tony Reid. I think it's called Indonesia Rising, isn't it? Yeah. But if you look not only at academic books, journal articles, but pieces coming out of think tanks, like the Lowy Institute, and you read the Financial Review or the Australian, and there are articles that everyone's expecting Indonesia to suddenly wake up, shake its head, get up, and get up there with Japan and China and grab the leading role in Asia. But it's not only think tanks and academic commentators. It's also business associations. The Australia-Indonesia Business Association is banging the drum and saying, look, Indonesia is the place to invest. It's got a huge new middle class, huge potential of consumers to buy goods and to act as a new market for things. So, and also the Australian government has been in there. You see some government statements by Foreign Affairs and Trade also saying that Indonesia is, or should be on the point of becoming a powerful new country in the region. Now the question is, why are they saying this? What's the basis for the argument that Indonesia is going to become a new power in Asia? Well, one argument is the fact that Indonesia's GDP has grown dramatically, over the past decade or two. Indonesia is now the 16th largest economy in the world by GDP. And, it certainly sits above it sits above countries like, for example, Turkey, above Thailand and Malaysia and that. It sits up there with a lot of European countries. By GDP, it is a big country. The second thing is that it's a big country with a large group of younger people and a large, what they call a consumer class. That is a middle class that likes to spend their time at shopping malls and buying things and that. So this is an indication that Indonesia has a big market and a big demand. Well, of course, this is very attractive to people like business associations, and it's very attractive to people like governments, because particularly in Australia, where the resource boom is gone, where the credit boom is gone, and we're all wondering, what do we do now? So the prospect of Indonesia sitting up there as a big market that we can sell lots of things to is very attractive. The problem is, of course, that Australia's trade and investment in Indonesia has not really shifted that much, and Indonesia is not a major destination for our overseas exports or our overseas investments, and it's not expanding to the degree that people would hope. The other reason that people are arguing that Indonesia is going to become a major power in the region is the success of its democratic experiment. Now, whether you think the same old people are still in charge, the really important thing, I suppose, institutionally, is that Indonesia has successfully made the transition from a dictatorship to a democracy, and that life is much freer and more open for people in Indonesia than it was before, and that Indonesia is quite different to lots of countries where when authoritarian regimes collapse, there might be chaos or gangsterism, this sort of thing. So Indonesia stands as a model, and particularly in the light of countries like Thailand too, which was seen as a model for democratisation. Now it's in a virtual state of civil war and social disintegration. And it's especially so in Indonesia, because Indonesia is a country that is essentially a Muslim society, an Islamic society, and a democratic political system. And it's a model in many cases where Islamic governments are confronted by Islamic movements that are populist and violent and in conflict with the government. Here is a model of how Islam and democracy can work together. Of course, the assumption here somehow is that by being a model, by showing how it can be done, this will give Indonesia some sort of soft power. Now, soft power is the idea that a country can be influential and powerful without going to war or without being an economic juggernaut. that it just influences other countries want to be like that country. So they listen to it. They accept its advice and leadership. A final point, I think, and this is quite an interesting point, is that a lot of people say, well, Indonesia is going to be a rising power. It's going to emerge to, if not great power status, at least greater power status, because people in Indonesia are increasingly seeing it like that. And if they increasingly see it like that, and you can think of, both SBY and Jokowi have made statements about Indonesia going to be more assertive internationally, and Indonesia, is going to sort of pull its weight in the international arena. And then, of course, in the election last year, Prabowo was talking about, that Indonesia must sort of realise its potential and show its authority internationally. There is a school of international relations. It's called the English School, and the basic argument there, it sounds like postmodernism to me, is that as long as people inside the country believe the country is going to be a powerful player internationally, and other countries think that too, then it is. Okay, so there's that. And people like Amitav Acharya, who has written briefly about Indonesia in this thing, seems to take this so-called English school view of things. Yet, if we look at the evidence, of things, like Indonesia might have the 16th largest GDP in the world, but how does that mean Indonesia is going to be powerful and influential in the world arena? The same as Australia. I mean, I don't know what we are. I think we're just a little bit above Indonesia. As the mines slow down, we'll probably fall below. But this doesn't naturally translate into things. How does these things like a democracy and GMP, how does that translate into being a world or a regional power? And when we look at the evidence of being a regional power, if we look at those people who've written about, mostly they say, the book or the article is about Indonesia rising. But then when you look closely at it, you'll see that most of these say, well, this is why Indonesia should be a great power, and this is why Indonesia could be a great power. But and some of them stop there, and others say, well, this is why it might not happen and it won't happen. So in other words, the whole, Indonesia rising debate doesn't seem to have a lot of enthusiasm about it when you come to look inside the debate. Most people who are debating about it are cautious and are backpedaling on the whole thing. So it's really an argument about the potential of Indonesia and why it should have and why it hasn't become. If we look at the arguments that are used in the debate about why Indonesia is going to be a great power or not, one argument is political. And that argument is that Indonesia really doesn't have the military or economic power to project its influence internationally. Because the Indonesian army has basically been an army more like a police force for domestic control rather than an army designed to project its power outwards. And people like White and Feely, have argued that, but as well as people like Rizal Sukma, and I think Dave McRae talks about that too. But there's also scepticism over its influence in soft power in organisations like ASEAN. It's argued that this soft power will give us more clout in ASEAN. And someone like Amitav Acharya argue that Indonesia is regarded as a leader in ASEAN, that Indonesia can be a broker it can be a bridge for countries in ASEAN. But when you look at that and you say, well, give us an example, there are not that many examples forthcoming. In the economic field, economists who are mostly market economists, like Chatib Basri and Hal Hill, and indeed Peter Drysdale, who is not an Indonesia expert, he's a Japan expert, but their general argument says, well, the problem is really that there hasn't been enough market reform. It's not too much market reform, not enough market reform. Indonesia remains locked in protection, state intervention, and inefficiency. That Indonesia is hampered in becoming a big exporter and investor, because the supply side costs are too high. It costs more to produce things, to export things, to arrange finance for things, and so on, because of corruption and inefficiency and waste. You could go back to the 1970s and 80s, and there was this argument about the high-cost economy, and they were the same sorts of points then. So the argument, of course, is that bad governance and corruption places the supply side costs in Indonesia at the upper level and prevents it from becoming a great power. And the other argument is that Indonesian nationalism, we're talking about the English idea that if you think you're big and others think you're big, you are big. The argument there is that nationalism that's emerged in Indonesia, which might be expected to project Indonesia's power outside in the world, takes the form of projecting it back inside. It's taken the form of more protection, reinforcing state enterprises, controlling the entry of foreign capital, this sort of thing. This is what the argument is. Now, getting to our argument about things. I think an important point that we would want to make is what really constitutes whether a country is building or exerting regional power and influence. That it's all right to say that a country's got a big GDP or that it's got a working democratic model, but you've got to argue how these translate into more power. Soft power, we would argue, is not the beginnings of exerting power in other areas, but it's a byproduct. That people say America has soft power because of its television, its control of social media. A lot of people want to become like Americans. Lots of young Australians talk with an American accent now. They generally grow out of it. I remember when I was younger, a lot of young Australians used to affect an English accent, and then they grew up and forgot about it. So now it's an American. Everyone wants to be like this is soft power. It's argued that other people want to be like you. Well, our argument is that soft power doesn't just pop out of the world by itself. It is the product of other forms of power. If America, you don't get Paraguay exerting soft power, but nobody goes around talking like a Paraguayan. Why not? Well, because Paraguayan is not a big, powerful country that you want to be like. So we would argue that soft power is a bit of a cop-out. Real power, if we want to really measure if a country's powerful or influential, I think you've got to look at its capacity to influence and shape the rules global rules, the rules of how we do business, the rules of how investment takes place, the rules of law and that. So if you look at America through the World Trade Organization, which was largely built, in the 80s and 90s, its concern was with trade, with opening the doors to trade mainly for US exports, but to impose a set of rules that really benefited a great power. Now with the TPP, they've virtually forgotten about trade. What they're interested in now is building a set of rules for investment and a set of rules to protect property rights. So what they want to establish are these informal courts where companies can sue governments if they think that governments have introduced policies that disadvantage them. And they have a special system of courts and law that operate outside. In other words, this is a very highly anti-democratic notion and an attack on the sovereignty of countries. But this is how power is exerted. I was recently visiting Africa. I went to Kenya and Tanzania, and the Chinese are there building a massive high-speed train through Kenya. It goes up through Kenya and into Uganda and probably eventually down into the Congo. Why have they built this train? I mean, they built lots in China, they got lots of expertise, but the train is going to carry minerals and that out of the Congo down to Mombasa. In Tanzania, the roads are nice and paved compared to other countries in Africa because the Chinese have done it. They're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They've got bigger fish to fry, and these bigger fish are the minerals and the energy that they hope to get out of Africa. So if they can build the infrastructure, they can get it out fast. They build the infrastructure, they're helping the governments, they're getting a better relationship with governments. So this is, I didn't see any Indonesian companies there. I didn't see any Indonesian companies doing this sort of infrastructure work, or I haven't seen any Indonesian banks operating around the world compared, say, to Japanese or Chinese or European or American banks. So this is what we mean by power. It's not just because you have a big GDP or that you have a working democracy. Power is a different, you've got to use that to build on it. So our argument, we see things in different terms. And we see, a lot of the problems pointed out by people who write about Indonesian rising, we agree with. We agree with, a lot of the problems of that there are problems of corruption and all that sort of thing. But we see the question in terms of the fact that these things don't automatically translate into regional or global power and influence. And we don't see them as a matter of, perception of your power. Every country you go to and you ask people, they will probably think their country is more powerful or influential than it is. If we go to America and they say, "Where are you from?" and you say Australia, they'll say, "Oh yes, the Sound of Music." Well, of course, what they're thinking of is Austria. Admittedly in America, not that many people travel overseas, but everyone's surprised. "Oh, you don't know that about my country?" Well, no, I'm sorry to say. Now, instead, we argue that the expansion of power is usually undertaken when it is required structurally for the survival and expansion of specific types of economy, specific types of political power. and for the interests of economic and political classes that are embodied within them. So what we're saying is that there is a structural process behind all of this. Now let me give a couple of examples of what I mean by this. For example, if we go back to the 17th, 18th and maybe early 19th century, countries like Britain and to a lesser extent, the Netherlands, they were mercantile economies. In other words, they made, and they were economies in the early stages of an industrial revolution. These relied for their survival on the capture and subordination of colonial empires. Colonial empires as sources of resources and of partially processed resources so that they could bring them back to Britain or other countries and manufacture them to a higher level. Okay? All their business relied on getting, sort of textiles or cotton from India, spices, sugar, coffee from Indonesia, various things from Africa. And so they built whole colonial empires, not that they could just go there and trade, but they could politically control it. They could control the supply, control the prices. They didn't just buy it from people. In Indonesia, they established a whole plantation economy. They established rural banks, that could fund this. So and in the UK, you had a whole political class that relied on this. They formed the officials that went out, they were the traders. The government relied for its revenues on this. In other words, structurally, that form of global expansion, that is the exercise of political power to enforce these economic and social interests of the country, were structurally required by the sort of economy that it was. Not just because people thought they'd have an empire. There were some sort of cases like that. The Germans at the late stage felt, well, everyone else has got an empire, we should have one too. But generally, and then if we look at the case of Japan at the end of the First World War, the Great Japan industrial expansion required that they expand its industrial base. That's why they went into Korea, into Manchuria and into Taiwan, and they built large industrial bases there. The Japanese used these as colonies. They set up factories. They manufactured steel and iron and railway stock and all this sort of thing. And that fed into the Japanese economic enterprise, which then exported products to the West. So it was structurally tied to the economy of Japan. They required it. And the Japanese military fed into that. They became a large occupying military that spread throughout the North Asian region. And so with the US. If you ever want to read an interesting book about US foreign policy, it's called All the Shah's Men, written by a guy called Kinzer, Kinzer. And it shows exactly how the CIA and the British MI6 or whatever it was then were responsible in Iran for overthrowing a democratically elected government of a guy called Mohammad Mossadegh and installing the Shah, because things weren't suiting them the way they went. You see, in the late 19th century, the US economy required expansion of its political power to guarantee its corporations their investments overseas, their access to raw materials. For example, it's everything from bananas in Central America through the United Fruit Company. It might seem silly, but the Americans went in overthrew lots of governments and installed lots of dictators right throughout the Central American region to ensure the safety of US investments there. And in the Middle East, they did the same for Standard Oil, Texaco, Mobil and other companies. They engaged in vast and ongoing projects of regime change to contain not only leftist but liberal democratic governments. And of course, if you want to look back at the origins of the situation in the Middle East, you can find them in the way that the US, Britain, and to a lesser extent France, manipulated the way in which these economies worked, largely because they required the oil in the region. They wanted to keep Russia out of the place, and so that this is a structural imperative. And the thing is that in Indonesia today, you don't see these structural forces at work. The survival, the expansion of powerful groups and governments in Indonesia is not reliant on projecting its power internationally. You could ask, for example, Fede asked me this, how do we explain why Russia is sort of trying to expand its power again? Well, it may be that this activity is for domestic consumption. It might have more to do with how Putin controls domestic politics than international politics. But this is a question, I think, that we have to ask. You see, and this is why I think that if you're going to study a country like Indonesia or any country in the world, you have to have a perspective that you can look at it. You have to be able to compare it with what happens elsewhere, with other countries, and in previous times. So that I think the worst thing that can be done is to sort of become buried in a single place at a single time. You've got to be able to place it in perspective. So where do we get from this? What would our argument be about Indonesia rising? Now, of course, one of the problems, one of the things that we see is that that a country can't be understood outside its global context. That's why, we see, Sukarno projected in Indonesia's power. He sent troops into Kalimantan or north, into Sabah and Sarawak, even landed some troops in Malaysia. He conducted this confrontasi policy. He held the Bandung Conference, and took a very confrontational line with the West. He confronted Western economic interests and Japanese economic interests by trying to build big state corporations. We have to remember that was a time of great turmoil in the world. That was a time of the Cold War. That was a time of the end of colonies, and he had people like Nkrumah from Ghana, and I think Zhou Enlai came down to that conference too. And so the world, I suppose, over the last 30 years until recently, has become a pretty stable and boring place. There's no opportunities for countries to grandstand, to move beyond their own borders. They simply fitted into the systems that were operating. We think that if we want to explain the problem of Indonesia's non-rise, one factor is that an economy was already formed. Its economy already sat within a world economy that was already largely established and ordered. The rules were set, systems of power were operated. It's very difficult to break into it when everything is so entrenched. Its role essentially was to produce raw materials, oil, coal, agricultural products, this is for the global economy, attempts to move downstream into heavy industry under Sukarno, for example, this failed because, and we can compare it with how, say, Korea did it or other countries did it to get an idea of why this failed. And of course, we have to look at the BRICS, which I mentioned before. We see today that Brazil's in real trouble. Russia is in trouble as well economically. India seems to be growing, but there are serious doubts about the internal structure and cohesion of Indonesia. And China, there also is a debate going on about why China will never overtake the US. And it's the same debate because it can never catch up. The US has got too much of a lead. It has the infrastructure already developed, the universities, the research. It's already been its control of the rules and that it's already in place. It's very difficult. Now, the structural reasons within Indonesia for change. One important structural reason, I think, it's true that some liberal economists say, well, one of the problems, why hasn't Indonesia been able, for example, to create a very powerful and influential manufacturing export economy? Why hasn't it been able to do this? Well, one of the reasons I argue is that the supply side costs, that the government is weak, the institutions are weak, there's too much corruption, there's not enough investment in infrastructure and so on. Well, of course, China also, China who floods the world with goods now, it's profoundly corrupt. We just look at the battle going on in China over corruption at the moment. Look at all the examples of local officials fighting local populations over the expropriation of land. How do we explain this puzzle? And I think that the explanation is that in all of the countries of Northeast Asia, Japan, China, South Korea, and in Taiwan, while there was corruption, the states still held on to strategic areas of autonomy. In other words, they were able to act autonomously in strategic areas for collective objectives. And usually these collective objectives were to build an economy that could invade the world, not politically, but economically. And while corruption continued to exist, it had to be accommodated within that and not fight against that project. So, for example, in China, why did this happen? Well, in China, I think the answer is that the whole period of communist government, which established a powerful centralised state with a powerful bureaucracy that depended not just on being corrupt, but on maintaining an autonomous power themselves. If Zhou Enlai, Chiang Kai-shek had become premier and defeated Mao, maybe we'd see a different story. In Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, is a successor to the sort of centralised rule that Japan had after the fall of the Meiji government. In Singapore, the PAP government. And in Korea, after Syngman Rhee fell, the military government of Park Chung-hee, these imposed this powerful centralised state that's never been imposed in Indonesia, where the fusion of public authority and private interest has never been defined. That Indonesia is much more embedded in being a rentier state, where this is not a dysfunctional state. It's not that it's disorganised and dysfunctional. it's a very efficient state for powerful people within the state and within the business, because it's an effective machine for capturing and allocating power and resources and wealth amongst these people. So one thing I think we need to look at, if we're going to talk about whether Indonesia has become or can become a rising global power, is to look at the nature of the state. The second is, I think, to look at the nature of Indonesia's ruling oligarchy. The people who are in business and who control. And I think here, its future hasn't laid, it's not about market reforms, because market reforms in Indonesia largely took the form for the private sector of giving them the power to operate in many of the sectors that were dominated by the government before, and giving them the monopolies in those areas, for example, in the banking sector or in other sectors. The interests of business in Indonesia is not to challenge the global economy or the hierarchy in the global economy. Its future lies in its capacity to secure for itself a share of these global investments, a share in the supply chains and in the export manufactures, resource processing, etc. That's why we understand nationalist policy now, not about projecting Indonesia outwards, but about demanding a share of this world economy within Indonesia by certain powerful groups within Indonesia. You know, protection of certain industries, demands that industries give some shareholdings to local people, these sorts of things. This is how we must understand that. This is not to say that Indonesian business hasn't expanded into Asia and other countries. The point is that it hasn't been a national project where business and the state have worked together. It's usually being carried out in the opaque and fluid structures of family businesses and financial networks within Asia that we don't know about, or that it's only with great difficulty we find out about, because it's not reported, it's not easily assessed and quantified in that. Now, I'm going to stop here because I would have to then go on and talk about the whole issue of politics, democracy, soft power and that. And that's Fedi's part of the paper. And we haven't really, got to the end of that. But I'll end there, and I think that, a lot of people might be a bit disappointed that, that this whole debate about Indonesia rising is largely a debate about why it's not rising, rather than why it is rising. But even by going into that debate, you enter into a whole argument about how do we understand Indonesia, how do we understand politics, the economy, and how they interrelate, and why different people have different interests in saying, like, for example, liberal economists would come here and say, it's not growing because they haven't deregulated enough. They're trying to contradict the markets. And there may even be some people saying, look, I've been an academic teaching about Indonesia for years and nobody comes to my classes. So here, if I can talk about an Indonesia that's about to take over Asia, it'll become incredibly interesting and people will come to, I'm not suggesting anyone's as cynical as that, but there are all of these forces at work. And so, it gives us an opportunity to analyse what's happening in Asia. And of course, in Australia, business associations are anxious to beat up the Indonesia thing, and governments are hopefully looking, where do we turn? Where does Australia go next? Oh, a big market in Indonesia. Indonesia's going to save us. So it gives rise to a lot of very interesting questions about how things happen in countries. Now, I'll just leave it at that. And of course, we've got time for a talk. I think I've gone over time, haven't I?
Just a little bit, that's all right.
Just an hour or two. Yes. Okay.